If you start a story with the words "once upon a time," you know what you're in for, right? That's a fairy tale. If you start a story with "'twas the night before Christmas" and all through the house, and then it rhymes with something about a mouse, you know what you're in for. There's a poem where magical things that might involve Santa Claus and reindeer will happen. There are certain cues that tell people what kind of story you're about to tell, whether it's a fairy tale or a delightful Christmas poem or a fable, or if you're telling a story that's grounded in history, you might start it like this. In the 15th year of the reign of Emperor Tiberius, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, and Herod was ruler of Galilee, and his brother Philip ruler of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias was ruler of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, the son of Zechariah, in the wilderness. Okay, I get it, that right off the bat, the opening words of the 3rd chapter of Luke's gospel sound dry and boring because he's basically just given us a recitation of who was in what official positions in power in both the Roman Empire and in the local provinces around Judea and Galilee, as well as who happened to be occupying religious positions of power and authority as John the Baptizer begins his ministry. But he's saying something. I mean, you may not know who where Trachonitis is or who Tiberius was. You might not know who the various high priests were or why they mattered. But you can tell that Luke, the narrator, is convinced he's telling not just a story like a fable or a children's nursery rhyme or a fairy tale. This is a story grounded in reality, in the real world where we live, and that makes this a different kind of story, maybe a subversive kind of story too. I mean, fairy tales you can sort of, shrug off, going, well, that's not really how the world works. There aren't really dragons, there aren't really princesses in towers with long hair, that kind of thing. But the moment we start naming real places, real people, and saying God has come into this real world, well, now we're talking about something. We can't ignore it or dismiss it as just childish. This is about a God who really enters into our history. And even more scandalously, after rattling off all those big deals and important people, the emperor and the local governors and the people in religious authority, Luke, the narrator, says that God comes to the middle of nowhere, to the wilderness, to find a guy named John, to call people who are anybody's and nobody's into the reign of God. That's powerful. That's kind of scandalous. And that's, of course, not surprising if we pay any attention at all to the way God works in the Bible. God is always dismissing the powerful and moving away from the centers where you expect God to show up, or the powerful or the important people, the big deals, and instead showing up in the middle of nowhere, in the literal wilderness even, to work and to gather anybody's into what God is up to. That's how the story of Jesus begins, and that's really how the whole story of God works. This coming Sunday, even though the world around us is rushing us toward Christmas and jingling bells and presents under trees, we're going to take a detour and hear about how God comes into real history in the real world with people like, Tiberius and Pontius Pilate and Herod and Philip, and yet God bypasses the powerful and shows up and meets us where we are, in ordinary sorts of places too. Sometimes we get this idea we're not important enough or a big deal enough for God to care about, that our lives just are small potatoes in the big scheme of things. But if we take the gospel seriously, that's exactly where we should expect God to show up, in the midst of the lives of us in our ordinariness and in our real lives. When we tell our kids the stories about God entering into history, we aren't just giving them fairy tales. We're telling them about a God who cares about this world and our history and our lives, who moves in the midst of this world and often overlooks the big deals and the expected powerful people and shows up among the anybodies and the nobodies, even in ordinary places like bread and wine and gathered people. So join us this coming Sunday as we hear again about the God who doesn't start off the story with "once upon a time" or "'twas the night before Christmas," but instead we hear the story of the God who meets us in real life, in real history, in the places where we live. See you Sunday.